We're taught that her death was due to the belief that she was a witch, but the truth, the part that is far more unsettling, is that she died precisely because she made a perfectly rational choice to survive. Ironically, her absolute certainty, her unwavering belief in her divine mission, was the most potent psychological force she possessed. Yet it was precisely this strength that the courts systematically used to dismantle her. Within the most sophisticated legal structure of the age, pause for a moment and imagine the sheer sensory unease of that cold stone cell, the unyielding metal biting into your wrist, and the chilling realization that your only remaining weapon against an entire system is your own desperate, raw honesty. Perhaps the deepest and most enduring betrayal in the history of human justice is not merely the act of cruelty itself, which is common, but the meticulously constructed and airtight legal justification that is deliberately engineered to follow and sanitize that cruelty. It is a profound historical irony. France was famously saved by a girl who spoke with God, yet that very girl was ultimately condemned to death by a panel of men who spoke nothing relentlessly but the rigid, unforgiving language of the law. The year is 1428, and the Kingdom of France is not just suffering losses in the 100 Years' War. It is facing a full existential collapse of its national belief system, a conflict that had already devoured generations and now was consuming all remaining hope. King Charles VII, uncrowned and functionally powerless, witnessed his territory shrink daily, squeezed tightly by the formidable English army and the constant betrayal of the Burgundian nobility, setting the stage for one of history's greatest turnarounds. This profound psychological devastation was the backdrop against which a simple peasant girl would arrive, carrying not professional military strategy or vast armies, but a singular, devastating concept that altered everything: absolute certainty, proving just. How much pressure it takes to break a kingdom, and what it cost one girl to fix it. Suddenly, Joan, a name that would soon reverberate across all of Europe, emerged from the profound insignificance of the village of Domremy, presenting herself at Chinon to Charles VII, claiming not to be a general, but an oracle, bearing a divine mandate. The king's court was cynical, exhausted, and intimately familiar with their own failures. They immediately interpreted her conviction as madness. Yet Charles, desperate and cornered with nowhere left to turn, granted her passage. Her actual power was never rooted in skill with a sword, which she barely possessed, but rather in the immediate spiritual transfer of her absolute faith onto a profoundly demoralized French army. Striking at the core of the problem, the greatest military challenge France faced was not a lack of manpower or effective tactics, but the deep, shared psychological certainty that they were destined to lose. The Siege of Orléans serves as the crucial hinge point of this entire historical narrative, having been held by the English for months as a strategic stronghold that symbolized the unyielding nature of their occupation, repeatedly repulsing French attempts to reclaim it with the very walls seeming to resist French national destiny. When Joan arrived, the atmosphere didn't just shift, it ruptured, providing a powerful pattern interrupt that converted fatigued professional soldiers into zealous participants in what they now perceived as a divine crusade, making this not merely a conventional tactical victory, but a spiritual one, where belief was weaponized to overcome brute force, illustrating how the rediscovery of French courage, authenticated by the armor of a teenage girl, led to the impossible taking of Orléans. This sudden triumph culminated in the ritual at Reims in 1429, where Charles was formally crowned king. Standing beside him was Joan, in her distinct, custom-made armor, serving as the physical, living embodiment of the French reversal of fortune. This single moment was the apex of her power, elevating her far beyond a simple military asset into a sacred symbol, incontrovertible breathing proof that the English dominion was clearly not sanctioned by God. and the English realized instantly that they could no longer defeat her through mere battlefield tactics, confirming that though her capture was perhaps inevitable, her total destruction required a far more sophisticated instrument than a sword. It required the cold, unyielding weight of the law itself. The true turning point arrived in May 1430 at Compiègne, where Joan was captured during what was intended to be a routine skirmish by Burgundian forces, an entirely conventional military event that should have followed established norms of medieval warfare, involving ransom exchange or political negotiation. Yet her fate immediately deviated from every standard expectation, as the Burgundians, firm English allies, quickly sold her for 10,000 livres tournois, a truly staggering sum that clearly underscored her value, revealing that they weren't purchasing a prisoner of war, but the very spiritual legitimacy of the entire French cause, which they intended to permanently erase by destroying its central icon. Joan was immediately transferred to the city of Rouen, the English administrative and military capital in France, which had been designated as the meticulously prepared stage for her legal annihilation, starting the proceedings in January 1431, framed as a solemn trial of the Inquisition and an ecclesiastical inquiry into heresy. The appearance given was one of scrupulous impartiality, guided by canon law and deep theological scrutiny. But the reality was a legal performance that was meticulously orchestrated by the highest levels of English military command and executed by Bishop Pierre Cauchon, an ambitious, openly pro-English prelate who was clearly motivated by the powerful lure of the Archbishopric of Rouen. The court, as we now know, was biased from the very first day, as Joan was intentionally denied the protections of the Church, and instead was imprisoned in an English military fortress guarded exclusively by openly hostile male soldiers, where her chains were real, but the surrounding legal framework functioned as an invisible, suffocating cage. Every judge was hand-picked specifically for his loyalty to the English purse and power, proving that they were not seeking truth, but were rather seeking a perfect theological and legal justification for an execution that had already been decided upon. Intending to prove through the meticulous application of church law one shocking angle that the Maid of Orleans was in fact nothing more than an agent of Satan. The trial lasted through 70 relentless sessions, pitting the finest, most ruthless theological minds of the age against a 19-year-old girl who was famously illiterate and denied any form of legal counsel, where the strategy was simple: continuous exhaustion, debilitating isolation, and the theological entrapment of her words. The judges repeatedly presented classic paradoxes, such as forcing her to answer if she knew she was currently in God's grace, a question deliberately designed to condemn her regardless of her answer. Yet to their astonishment, Joan demonstrated an instinctive, astonishing grasp of spiritual rhetoric and political consequence, deflecting their traps with a brilliance that genuinely confounded her learned inquisitors. When repeatedly pressed on the specifics of her communication with the saints or asked for details of her divine commission, Joan steadfastly refused to be drawn into minor trivial details, always returning to the core, singular assertion of her mandate to save France, leading to her famous countermove regarding God's grace. If I am not, may God place me there, and if I am, may God keep me there, which was not just an act of piety, but a perfect legal maneuver that successfully nullified the theological snare. It became immediately clear to the court that pure rhetoric and logical debate alone would never succeed in breaking her spirit, forcing the judges to escalate the coercion beyond the theoretical and into the realm of the physical. Recognizing that she would not yield verbally, the inquisitors introduced the psychological threat of physical suffering, bringing Joan directly before the instruments of prolonged coercion, the gruesome rack and the strappado, displaying them with the calculated intention of shattering her mental resistance and compelling a confession through the mere anticipation of agony. She fixed her gaze upon the devices of destruction, yet her resolution remained remarkably unbroken, demonstrating an extraordinary psychological fortitude, as she declared that even if they successfully tore her limbs apart, Any confession extracted would be immediately and publicly retracted, thereby completely invalidating their intended legal victory. This bold, unequivocal refusal to allow pain to corrupt her testimony forced the judges into a temporary retreat, as the legal record absolutely had to appear uncoerced. So physical torture was removed, but the strategy was simply refined. They would use fear, chronic exhaustion, and extreme isolation to achieve the exact same result. If they found themselves unable to break her through complex theology or overt physical pain, the court would try to break her through the false promise of mercy, effectively turning her very human desire for self-preservation into the final piece of evidence they so desperately needed. And the court immediately prepared the next and final phase of their complex trap. On May 24, 1431, Joan was brutally brought to the cemetery of Saint-Ouen, a vast public space where tall scaffolds were intentionally erected and immense crowds were drawn by the expectation of a spectacle and the noticeable smell of waiting wood, with the executioner standing visibly ready. This was the moment of manufactured choice. She could sign a document of abjuration, confessing that her voices were demonic and submitting fully to the church's authority, or she would be immediately handed over to the secular authorities for the fire, meaning life, was offered only in exchange for the absolute denial of her entire life's purpose. Terrified, exhausted, and severely worn down by months of confinement, starvation, and relentless interrogation, Joan ultimately signed the document. Though witnesses later attested during her rehabilitation trial that the paper presented to her was likely quite brief, perhaps only a few lines that she hastily marked without fully comprehending the dense legal terminology. Crucially, the record immediately entered into the court's archive was a comprehensive damning indictment, a clear act of ecclesiastical fraud, meticulously expanding and enhancing the confession. But the specific wording was secondary to the mechanism itself, as the trap was sprung not by the ink, but by the desperate willingness to sign, making people wonder if she realized the fatal error of believing in mercy. The bargain for a moment seemed complete. Prison instead of immediate execution, and Joan was returned to her fortress cell, still chained, still under guard by the same hostile English soldiers, genuinely believing she had survived by fulfilling the terms of the abjuration, by agreeing to submission and promising to wear only women's clothing. Yet her captors had never intended for the deal to genuinely hold. Bishop Couchot and the English command needed her dead, but they desperately needed her executed, not as a political prisoner, but under the perfect legal pretext of a relapsed heretic. Under the strict rules of medieval inquisitorial law, a first-time confessed heretic could still be offered mercy, typically resulting in life imprisonment. But a relapsed heretic, one who confessed and then returned to the original heresy, was legally beyond all possible mercy, and the relapse itself functioned as the automatic, undeniable sentence of execution, immediately handed over to the secular arm. For the English, this specific path was absolutely perfect. It successfully eliminated Joan while protecting the legal integrity of the court, shifting all blame for the execution onto the victim herself, who had supposedly willfully rejected the church's clemency, creating the chilling question of what conditions were necessary to force such an outcome. The conditions to force the relapse were immediately and deliberately set. Joan was intentionally returned to the military fortress, not a convent, and the degradation continued. Her head was shaved, and she was forced into a dress, a garment that, in the context of her imprisonment, immediately stripped her of physical protection. Throughout the previous trial, she had explained that her men's clothing, the tunic and tight hose, were secured with dozens of cords, precisely to function as a barrier against the pervasive, constant threat of sexual assault from her guards, meaning her male dress was a functional necessity for her personal security. Over the ensuing 4 days, the psychological pressure escalated relentlessly. The humiliation was constant, and the threats of assault were terrifyingly real and imminent, until, according to testimony later given at the rehabilitation trial, the final, calculated move was made. The guards intentionally removed the women's clothing from her cell, leaving her with only a sack containing the forbidden men's clothing, presenting Joan with an impossible decision:
stand completely defenseless, effectively naked before 5 hostile men, or put on the male clothing, an act that would explicitly violate the terms of her signed confession. She chose the only path to safety. On May 28th, the judges, knowing exactly what they would find, returned to the cell and found her dressed as a soldier once more, where Joan explained the harrowing circumstance. The women's clothing had been taken and she needed protection. She then confessed the true violation of the pact. Her voices, she admitted, had returned, condemning her for the weakness of the abjuration, which became
the exact tragic moment of her self-destruction. Because by admitting the return of the saints and the resumption of the forbidden attire spoken directly to her judges, she fulfilled the precise legal definition of a relapsed heretic. The verdict was instantaneous, unanimous, and delivered without any pause for reflection, declaring her a relapsed heretic and thereby sealing her fate, meaning the promise of life she had grasped lasted exactly 96 hours. The monstrous elegance of this legal trap lay in the fact that Joan had believed she was merely explaining the dire circumstances of her confinement, honestly seeking justification for a necessary act of self-preservation, never realizing that her basic honesty and her primal human need to protect her own body were precisely the mechanisms the court had meticulously engineered to deliver the sentence of death. 2 days later, on May 30th, 1431, Joan was solemnly escorted to the Old Market Square in Rouen, surrounded by 800 heavily armed English soldiers, ensuring absolute compliance and silence. The stake was tall, the wood meticulously prepared to burn quickly, reducing the time for any lingering reflection or potential public outcry, and, stripped of her armor and dressed in a simple white smock, she bore the paper cap, marking her as an apostate and relapsed idolater, the final damning labels of her legal destruction. At the scaffold, she bravely asked for a cross, which a nearby friar quickly fashioned for her from 2 pieces of stick, a crude but essential symbol of her enduring, unshakable faith. As she was bound tightly to the stake, she did not cry out in rage, but offered a cold, final testimony directly addressing the man who had authored her end, Bishop Couchon. "I die through you," which served as her final factual statement, confirming the political ambition that had ultimately driven the theological proceeding. Then, with the fire being lit beneath her feet, she requested the crucifix be held high, ensuring her final view was not of the faith, rising smoke, or the faces of her executioners, but of Christ alone. Witnesses recounted that even as the flames began to consume her, her voice rose clearly above the spectacle, not in curses, but in a fervent, repetitive, insistent prayer. "Jesus, Jesus, Jesus." A cry that served as a final, spontaneous, and powerful retraction of the forced abjuration. Her death was conceived as a public performance, intended to permanently erase her significance, yet the immediate effect was profoundly unsettling. With one English secretary intimately involved in the legal process, watching the blaze, and reportedly crying out in palpable horror, "We are lost. We have burned a saint." The English, determined to prevent her memory from becoming a source of relics or immediate veneration, took extraordinary calculated measures. After the first fire had consumed her, they raked back the embers to deliberately expose her remains to the crowd, visually confirming her death and sex. Then they burned the body again and again, meticulously reducing everything to fine ash, which was finally cast into the Seine River. The goal was total erasure, a clean deletion of the icon that had saved France. Yet they failed to understand that memory, once ignited by martyrdom, simply cannot be dispersed by water. 25 years later, the undeniable truth began its slow emergence when a rehabilitation trial was finally launched by the Pope to formally examine the dubious circumstances of the 1431 proceeding, calling over 100 witnesses, priests, notaries, judges, and even the guardsmen who had been present at the trial and in the cell. Under oath, they confessed to the manipulation, the fraudulent record, the severe violation of church law regarding her imprisonment, and the intentional pressure campaign that was specifically designed to force her relapse. The rehabilitation court definitively declared the original conviction a judicial and ecclesiastical fraud, finally clearing Joan's name and reputation, laying bare the sheer ambition of Bishop Cauchon and the political machinations of the English throne for all of history to see. Within a century, the Church confirmed what her soldiers and the crowds at Orléans already instinctively knew. Joan of Arc was a true saint, proving that the attempt at total erasure had failed utterly, replaced instead by a timeless legacy of martyrdom. Yet the most profound and chilling lesson of this story lies not in her eventual vindication, but in the terrifying precision of her demise. Joan of Arc did not intellectually collapse under the crushing weight of theological argument, nor did she physically break under the threat of physical torture. She was legally destroyed, simply because she temporarily trusted the rules of the system. She believed the institution contained a genuine procedure for mercy, and her signature was an act of rational survival, a perfectly sensible response to an immediate, overwhelming threat. Yet that single rational choice was the final, critical piece of evidence required to execute her. The system that ultimately consumed her was undeniably evil, but crucially, it was not chaotic. It was perfectly and ruthlessly engineered. When every other form of coercion failed, when the theology, the exhaustion, and the acute fear could not secure the required confession, the court deployed its ultimate contingency, the relapse trap, creating conditions where her self-defense, specifically wearing safe clothing to avoid sexual assault, became the definitive, undeniable proof of her guilt, successfully converting her very human need for security into the legal pretext necessary for her execution. The chilling echo of 1431, which is a key pattern throughout history, reveals that systems built on corruption and political expedience often provide an airtight, perfectly legal-sounding cover for the deepest and most calculated cruelties, showing the fragility of power and the terrifying precision of institutional betrayal.